So what you're looking at on the screen now is a diagram of the temple. And I do emphasize it's a diagram. It's not a ground plan of any known temple. But the temple itself was a microcosm of how they believed the creation to be. And this was not just the visible creation, but also the invisible creation. And if you look at that diagram, starting on the left, you have the Holy of Holies. We'll go through these several times. The Holy of Holies, and then those dashed lines, that's the veil of the temple, which was red and blue and purple and white. And then coming through to the right again, this is the main part of the temple. It was known as the Hechal, the hall, and that corresponded roughly, but only very roughly, to the nave of a traditionally shaped church. And then moving outside, there are the two great pillars, Jacob and Boaz, and then beyond that, number 5, the great altar of sacrifice outside, and then number 6, the extreme right, that was the great bronze sea, the bath of water, in which the priests were purified. So going back to the left-hand side again, so starting again from the Holy of Holies, you'll see that across the top there are a series of numbers. And the numbers correspond to the days of creation. For some reason, the number on the right, this is due to my inexpertise, says 26. It should actually say 6. So please correct that. And if you look underneath, you will see how in the biblical account, and remember these biblical accounts were written in their present form in the time of the Second Temple, based on material that had been inherited from the First Temple. And so various hiccups have come into the system. But at its simplest, underneath 1, there is the Holy of Holies, and the Holy of Holies represented day 1 of creation, so the beginning of Genesis chapter 1. And this was the separation of light from darkness. And in the assembling of the desert tabernacle, which happens at the end of Exodus 40, this is the very stylized account of how Moses assembled a place of worship in the desert. This corresponds to setting up the outer structure of the tabernacle, which was replicated as the temple, much bigger, obviously, in the temple. What you have to bear in mind is that the people who wrote up the account of the tabernacle of Moses knew the second temple, not the first temple of the time from Solomon onwards, so from 950 until about 600 BC. And a lot of their descriptions of the tabernacle of Moses have been coloured by the temple that they knew. But unfortunately for study of the temple, the second temple was very different in certain respects from the first temple, including the location of various items of furniture, and I will come back to that in a moment. So under number 2 in the diagram, you have the veil of the temple, and this corresponds to the second day of creation. And this is the firmament that separates the upper waters from the lower waters. It separates the state represented by the Holy of Holies from the state represented by the Great Hall, the Hechal. This is very important for understanding temple theology. And then 3 and 4 together, they indicate the table of showbread, that's number 3, and the great menorah, that is number 4. And those two correspond to the third and fourth days of creation. The third day is the day of the plants and the separating the land from the sea and so forth. That was represented by a table for plant offerings. And so they offered bread and wine and incense, and some accounts say salt, but that is disputed. And then the fourth is the lights of heaven, and that's represented by the seven-branched lamp. Then on the fifth day, you have the great altar of sacrifice outside, and this is when represents when the birds and fish were created. Of course, fish were not sacrificed, but birds were. And then the pattern breaks a little, but you must remember it's a very old pattern. The animals created on the sixth day, along with Adam, they really belong on the fifth day because they too were offered as sacrifice. But the important thing about the sixth day is this is the creation of Adam. Adam, the human being. Adam does not mean a male person, it means a human being. And later on, in the next two chapters of Genesis, Adam is divided into male and female. But collectively, Adam, he is undivided at this point. And the creation of Adam in the Genesis story corresponds to the setting up of the great bath for purification. In the traditional translations, it's called the Bronze Sea. And this is where the priests were purified for service. And Adam, the human being, is remembered in Jewish tradition and indeed in early Christian tradition as the first high priest. And so Adam's role is not, despite all the wonderful environmental sermons we have heard to this effect, Adam is not the steward of creation. Adam is the high priest of creation, and he leads the worship of creation. So that's very important. You can get good sermons from bad exegesis. Adam, the steward of creation, is bad exegesis, but you can get some good sermons from it. Right, see the next one. Now, if you want to see details of all this, the easiest place to access it in English is to go to Louis Ginsburg's wonderful 6-volume work, The Legends of the Jews, and you'll find all the Adam and Temple material in volume 1. And then the footnotes are so numerous that they have a separate volume, and you'll need to look for those in volume 5. So if you want to pursue this fascinating introduction to the world of the temple, then this is where you want to go. Right, look at the next one. Now, this is the creation of Adam. Then God, of course is plural here, says, let us make man, Adam, that's the human being. And then we start to have reference to the different states that the temple represents. As our image, Tzalmenu, that is something solid, and it belongs in the outer part of the temple where you have the material creation. But according to our likeness, that's more difficult, because this word demut, which I put at the bottom of the screen there, is actually the invisible heavenly pattern, and it belongs actually outside the temple in the realm that's even above the realm that is represented by the Holy of Holies. And so here you have your first introduction to the states that are envisaged as part of the temple way of viewing the process of creation. You have beyond the temple itself a state of invisible heavenly patterns. And then we shall come to this in a moment. In the Holy of Holies, the visionary who entered there could see those invisible heavenly patterns in the form of a vision that had a distinct outline to it, if you like, but had no actual solidity or substance. And then when you move out one further stage, you find that what was the mare in the outline in the Holy of Holies becomes the solid image or the statue. Now, some more things about the next one. At the top there, I put the 3 stages. You could use the word emanation, but when you say that, you start thinking of Platonism and Gnosticism and all sorts of things. So I'm just going to call them the 3 stages. In a stage beyond the temple, that's in the grey box, you have the Demut. Then in the Holy of Holies, you have the Mare, sometimes Mara, which is the outline without solidity. And then in the outer state, you have the Tselem, which is something that is in the material world. Now, these 3 states correspond to the 3 degrees of holiness. And so when you are outside the temple, you have this state called holy, holy, holy. And that doesn't mean extremely holy. It means a different quality of holiness. And I'm trying not to use words that are too theologically loaded at this stage. When you are in the Holy of Holies, so you are beyond the veil, there you are holy, holy. The familiar translation of that state is the Holy of Holies, or the Most Holy. And this represented a state of unity that was beyond time and matter. Now, you may recall that when I described the days of creation, I didn't say the first day of creation and then the second, third, and fourth. I said day 1 and then second, third, and fourth. Because in all the old texts, both the Hebrew and the Greek, it is not described as the first day. It is not described as part of a temporal sequence that preceded the second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth days. Day 1 stands apart, and this was explained by the Jewish teachers as this was the unity from which all the diversity comes forth. And the diversity of time and matter only begins once you have passed through the veil and come out into the hall of the temple, the material creation. And this is where things are separated out, and they are within time and matter, and so they have a beginning and they have an end. You have to imagine the state of the Holy of Holies beyond the veil, and the veil represents matter. We haven't got time to go into that this evening. It represents a state outside time, outside matter, and therefore a state that is not divided. It is a state of absolute unity. And this is a very important element of temple theology, because underlying, not temporally preceding, but underlying in the present, all the diversity and separation around us, there is a most holy unity that undergirds everything. Let's have the next one. Now, when the high priest, and it was only the high priest who could enter the Holy of Holies, and remember that the king in the time of the monarchy was also a high priest, he was a Melchizedek high priest. When the high priest entered the Holy of Holies, he caught the holiness and became a holy one or an angel. And the distinction between the 3 sorts of holy is that if you are holy, it means you have received holiness and you can't pass it on. If you are in the Holy of Holies, or most holy, then you are in a place that is, if you like, infectiously holy, And so when you enter the Holy of Holies, you catch the holiness and you are transformed by it. And you become someone who can pass on holiness. So a holy one or an angel, it's the same in temple tradition. When he emerges, he can pass on holiness into the material state. But one who has simply received ordinary holiness doesn't pass it on. How do you acquire most holiness or holy of holies? Well, this is this state of the demut, the completely unformed and beyond human comprehension state that is holy, holy, holy. And the means of transmitting this holy, holy, holy was the oil that was used for anointing. No detail as to how this was understood has survived, which is very frustrating. But we do know that when something or someone was anointed, and they anointed the high priests and the temple furnishings, when something or someone was anointed, they became infectiously holy. Now, one of the curious things that's sometimes said by critics of the New Testament, reading, for example, Matthew's Gospel, is that on the occasions when people of Jewish heritage are said to have knelt before Jesus, worshipped him, or knelt before him, they say, well, this can't possibly, this must be Matthew just kind of embellishing the story a bit to make it sound a bit more exciting, because they say Jews would never worship a human being. But this is not how outsiders, foreigners, Gentiles saw it. And there is a very famous quotation from Hecataeus, and he wrote this about 300 BC, and it's only survived in Diodorus the Sicilian. He's describing the temple in Jerusalem as he knew it, 300 BC. And he says of the high priest, they call him the high priest, and they regard him as the angel messenger of the mind and commands of God. Angel, messenger are the same word in Hebrew and in Greek as it happens. And they say that he reveals what has been commanded. And the Jews are so obedient in these matters that they prostrate themselves to the ground and adore him. And the Greek word used is proskunein, which is a word that is used for homage and worship. So people kneeling before Jesus in reverence suggests that these were people of Jewish heritage who recognized something about Jesus, that the high priest could emerge bearing with him a form of holiness which he could pass on, but those who received it couldn't pass on until they had been anointed, entered the Holy of Holies, and so on. Now, let's look at just a few lines from Philo. Philo tries to describe this process of emerging, and he describes it in terms of numbers and very primitive geometry. Now, this is from his treatise on the creation, it's chapter 49, and I've picked bits out of it because those of you who read Philo will know that he rambles round and round and round, and you do have to pick out the points from all the verbiage. So he says, one, point forms. When you have two, in other words, you join 2 points, it becomes a line. A line is length without breadth. If breadth is added, there results a surface, which comes under the heading 3. And to bring it to a solidity, it needs depth, and so this is 4. And it was this number 4 that led us out of the realms of the incorporeal existence, so the non-material world beyond the veil, open only to the intellect, and introduced us to the conception of a body of 3 dimensions, which first comes within the range of our senses, meaning our human senses. And the world of the Holy of Holies is this curious world just before the world of number 4. It's like a flatland where everything is distinguishable, but it has no material substance. Now, look at the next one. This is from Clement of Alexandria, and it's from his excerpts from the Gnostic teacher Theodotus. And there are 2 books called Excerpts from Theodotus, which does not help. And if you look up one and find 190 and it's not this text, look up the other one and it will be. Why? The publishers haven't sorted this out, goodness knows. Anyway, this is what Clement actually says. The Logos became flesh, not only at his parousia, so when he comes into the material world, but in the beginning, which is one of the names that temple theology gives to the Holy of Holies. In the beginning, the Logos, in the same way, became the Son in outline, and the word is perigraphe. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. That is describing the Son in outline before the Son emerges through the veil and becomes flesh and takes on the material and solid form. So there is this process of emerging, if you like. Now look at the next one. I'm going to take you back now to the end of the First Temple period. And Ezekiel was from a First Temple priestly family, although the priesthood and the temple had ceased to function before Ezekiel was old enough actually to serve in the temple. So he would have inherited as his patrimony the priestly traditions, although he never actually served there. And Ezekiel famously describes the glory of the Lord leaving the polluted temple in Jerusalem. And this is this terrible chapter, Ezekiel chapter 1, and then you get it again in chapters 8 and 10, but these bits are from chapter 1. And this is the wheels within wheels chapter. And if you wrestle with the original Hebrew, you get all the way through it and you say to yourself, what on earth was that about? Because that's what Ezekiel wrote. If you read a translation of Ezekiel chapter 1 that makes sense, it is not an accurate translation. So take heart. Struggle with a traditional translation, which is literal and seems to make no sense. So Ezekiel is describing the great throne, which they believed in the Holy of Holies, and he is describing the heavenly reality that that represented, and it is leaving. This is the glory of the Lord leaving the temple. And he's describing the living creature. So the firmament that was over their heads was the likeness of a throne, the appearance of a sapphire stone. And there's that word, mare. This is his visionary state in the Holy of Holies. And what was the invisible, I'm trying to avoid using Platonist terms, but the invisible essence of a throne from way beyond, it appeared to him like a sapphire stone, its appearance. And upon the likeness of the throne, that's this invisible state, there was the likeness again as the appearance, here it is, of a man or Adam upon it. So he sees a throne, if you like, in outline. This is a sort of flatland. And he sees upon it the vision, without substance, of a man or an Adam. And then at the end of this very convoluted discourse, he says, this was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. So this is describing that middle state, how they envisaged what was in the Holy of Holies. It was something that was distinct, but it had no actual substance. But what is interesting to note here is that the completely invisible and beyond human imagination state, that is the holy, holy, holy state, that could appear in different ways. And for example, the divine essence could appear as the Adam figure or as the high priest. It could also appear, take material form, if you like, in the bread of the presence, the lechem panim. So the business of how the divine enters the material world is not so simple as perhaps some have thought. Now, for the rest of the time I have, my next half hour or so, I'm going to tell you something about a most extraordinary phenomenon. And there are some little lead books that have been found in Jordan. They were found some time ago, and they seem to encapsulate the temple theology of the first temple, with all this idea of sort of emanations and things taking form in the Holy of Holies and finally appearing on earth and so forth. This is a lead book. It definitely exists. I've held it in my hand. When I work on it, I work with huge enlargements. The original is about the size of a bank card. In other words, it's very small. It was originally a separate tablet. I have worked on some other tablets, but I'm just going to talk about this one today. It was originally a separate tablet, but you can see it's been pierced through, and it was bound together with 5 other tablets to form a small book. Why this is interesting is that all this theological interpretation comes from reading words that are formed around and by passing through the menorah. And I am becoming more and more convinced that whatever is on this tablet is the grandmother or the great-grandmother of Kabbalah, which is why I'm introducing this to you now. So let's look at the next one. Here, now this is a line drawing that I use. I made line drawing of the tablet and straightened it up a bit. And when I'm working on these, I have these at a magnification up to an A4 sheet, so just huge, but otherwise you can't really deal with the intricacy of it. And this tablet is divided into 3 zones, which correspond to what happens in the various stages of the temple. So if you start at the top, this is the highest heaven beyond human perception. This is the state of the Demut. In the middle, you have, and I've drawn it as a complete red square because the Holy of Holies was a cube of 20 cubits. And this central section of the tablet, which is in a fairly elaborate code, which I'll tell you about in a moment, and this Holy of Holies is the state where holiness was acquired, where things were seen as visions and existed in outline. So this is the Mara state. And then right at the bottom, this is the material temporal state. This is the state of the Tselem. And you'll notice here that the menorah is in the Holy of Holies. If you think back to the first picture I showed you, the menorah there is not in the Holy of Holies. The menorah there is out in the main body of the temple. And the tabernacle, Moses' tabernacle, is also said to have had the menorah in the main body of the tabernacle, not in the Holy of Holies. But, as I said, the account of Moses' tabernacle was influenced by what the scribes knew of the Second Temple. If you go to the Christian Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, which is a wonderful description of temple theology as it formed early Christianity, there is no question that there the menorah is in the Holy of Holies. And so what you're dealing with in this lead tablet is the temple tradition that fed into Christianity and somehow, somewhere, by someone, had been kept alive and flourishing during the 6 centuries and more that since the first temple was destroyed. So there are these lead tablets raise far more questions than they answer, but then that's always a good basis for research. Now, I have marked on that picture the central lamp. The central lamp in the menorah, even in mainstream Jewish tradition, represents the Lord. And then you have the three nodes of the menorah. Those are very, very important. I don't think we should get as far as that today. You have to wait a month for that one. To see how certain words that pass, where the lines pass through those nodes, are of particular significance. And so you have, across the top of the menorah, you have the 7 lamps, and then you have the 3 nodes, and between them they make, of course, the 10, which Kabbalists are very familiar with. And if you look down the central stem, you'll see they're divided by 3, by 2, and by 1. Those are also significant. And by the time I think we get to the third of these talks, I will show you how what we recognize and identify as Pythagorean geometry, in fact, comes from this particular menorah. All those apparently random blobs that make up the menorah are carefully counted, and lines that pass through them show the basis of all sorts of things: triangles, hexagons, pentagons, all sorts of things. Anyway, let's see the next one. And on this one, I have just outlined them, the oracle page. I called this the oracle page, and I've let the cat out of the bag. I believe that these tablets were things that the prophets and the high priests were trained to read, and from them they could produce the messages that came from the Lord. So when a prophet emerged and says, "Thus says the Lord," he has had access to reading one of these things, or to someone who could read them. Very, very complicated things. Now, let's look at the next one. The oracle page is read by finding pairs of words that exactly mirror each other. Now, there is a style throughout the ancient Levant and the ancient Near East, which scholars have called gemination. And this is the custom of putting things in pairs, or if you are using an image, then you draw an important person twice. If you go to the Nineveh Gallery in the British Museum, you'll see the great Assyrian kings on either side, as it happens, of a tree of life. And you'll find 2 kings, mirror image of each other. These are very important people, so they are drawn twice. And we see this a little bit on the oracle page, because the oracle page is actually about the coming of the Messiah, the shoot that is growing again from the stump of the great tree. You remember Isaiah's oracle. And the menorah page actually shows 2 shoots coming, 2 leaves coming, gemination, because it is a very important point. So in the manuscript, the Hebrew manuscript of Ben Sira, now he's in the Apocrypha as Ecclesiasticus, but the English Apocrypha is translated from a Greek text of Ben Sira, which is very interesting. But the Hebrew text, which only exists in fragments, is even more interesting. And one of the things Ben Sira says as a statement of his philosophy, this is written about 200 BC. Look out on all the works of God. All of them are in pairs, one opposite, and then the Hebrew text of this particular part is broken, so we don't know. But the important thing is there, all the works of God are in pairs, one opposite, and the Greek tells you it's one opposite the other, but we could have guessed from that. So using that principle, finding them in pairs opposite each other, I'm going to give you a little bit of a lesson on how to read a lead tablet. So let's look at the next one. Now here If you look at the red line and start at the black dot, and you follow the red line down and then up, notice it goes through the central lamp, which is the sign of the Lord. And that is the old form of the divine name, Yahoo. I forgot to tell you that this tablet is written in a curious form of archaic Hebrew script. I'll tell you about that in a month's time and give you a little lesson on how to read some of the strange letters. If you follow the blue line, again from the black dot, you go down and then up, it crosses the red line at the central lamp, and that says, my shepherd. So that's a dead easy one. So we know what we're looking at. This is something about the Messiah. You see the geminated shoot at the bottom coming from the stump of the great tree. The title for the Lord is my shepherd. It comes through the central lamp that is the Lord, and it goes up into the highest heaven, and it originates in the highest heaven. And if you read that sign from right to left, it talks about the sign in heaven. And if you read it from left to right, just those two letters actually say that the sign is the Tav cross. My sign, the diagonal cross, was the sign of the name of the Lord, and it was marked on the high priest, and indeed on Christians in baptism. And if you look at the two letters opposite each other by the black dots where they begin, so these are in the Holy of Holies. This is the God who sees, if you read it from left to right, and if you read it from right to left, it is the precious one. So that's a little bit of how you read those two very simple lines. Now I'm going to take you up to level perhaps 1.5 of reading lead tablets. The location of the words indicates their place in temple theology. So the square is the Holy of Holies, in which there is the menorah, and this is where all the changes take place and start to take visible form and all the rest of it. Up in the highest heaven, you have a pair of words. Now, on the right, in red, starting to read at the black dot, you have the name Shaddai. Shaddai, despite the English translations, does not mean Almighty. Shaddai means the one with breasts. This is the female mother figure that was so important in temple theology. You find her later as the Shekinah in Christian theology, the Holy Spirit. She is the mother figure. And her mirror image on the left, up in higher heaven, is the blue line. Again, you start from the black dot, you move across and up, and that says she overclouds. Now, the mother figure overclouding important events is familiar from the New Testament. If you remember the account of the Transfiguration, there is a bright cloud. The voice comes from the cloud and says to the disciples, this, meaning Jesus, is my son, listen to him. That's the background of that idea. The word for voice in Hebrew is a masculine noun. And so where there is an unattributed voice in the Hebrew scriptures, it would naturally be translated, there was a voice and he said. But it's not a he. It should be, there was a voice and it said. And the it is the female mother figure who overshadows and overclouds the temple. So there she is. Now let's go down and now read something in the Holy of Holies. This is the king reigning in the Holy of Holies. And if you look on the right, you have a triangle. If you start the red dot and you take the lower line, and then you go up and you complete the triangle, So you're reading round 4 letters, 1, 2, 3, 4. That says David. If you take the exact mirror image, but don't complete the triangle, just use the 3 letters once each, that says the morning star. And we know that one of the great titles of the Davidic kings was the morning star. Jesus claims it for himself at the end of Revelation. I'm the bright morning star, the root and offspring of David. So that's a pair of titles that come from the Holy of Holies, where this was conferred. If you come to the bottom, right at the very bottom, now we're on earth, and sometimes when you're reading this code, and it is very complicated, you have the positioning of the words tells you something about, if you like, their theological location. So if you start with the red box and read it from the black dot on the left of it, that says salvation. But overlapping it and coming out from it, if you like, is the blue box. If you start reading in the other direction, the blue box, it says Zion. And so on earth, salvation comes out of the Zion when David, the morning star, has been anointed in the Holy of Holies. And we're back very much with First Temple theology of the Davidic monarch. Now that's a very simple piece of reading. Let's get a little bit more complicated now. Now, here we've still got the Holy of Holies, and we've got things happening between the bottom line, which is the earth, and the top 2 lines, in fact, just the lower of the 2 lines here, and exact mirror image. Now, there's slight distortion in this lead tablet. It's been battered, to put it mildly, and I suspect the original, the lines were more exactly aligned, but it's the second letter in each case. So if you start with the blue arrow on earth and you go up to heaven, so you're going up, you're going through the Holy of Holies into the highest heaven, that says witness. And when you return from the highest heaven, the red arrow coming down, exact reverse, that says knowledge. And you find many examples of pairs of words which you read going up and coming down, and they tell you something about the process of ascent. And I will deal with that in the third of these talks. If you look at the exact mirror image of that, which is on the left, the green arrow going from earth to highest heaven is the prophet, and coming down, he returns as a son of God. Now, another of these tablets, which I'm not going to be able to show you at all because time constrains us, shows another image, different set of letters, and a complete description of the role of the prophets and who they were and what they did. It is a most extraordinary thing to decode, if you want to use that word. Right, let's look at the next one. Now, I'm going to show you just one example of how a familiar, if you like, biblical story can be read from this oracle page. So a complete vision can be read from the oracle page. And the temple myth and ritual, I've said this already, is the framework for the book of Revelation, the coronation of the Davidic king. If you remember, right in the middle of the book, and the book of Revelation is also in 2 halves, just like one of these lead tablets, right in the middle, the woman clothed with the sun appears in the Holy of Holies and gives birth to a son who is set on the throne. So this is coronation material. And the woman, you get the preliminaries at the end of chapter 11, and then it starts in chapter 12. That chapter division is in a rather unfortunate place. And he is the Davidic king, and so he's not the great powerful master. He's the humble and despised servant of the Lord who redeems his people. So let's look at how we can read that story from the oracle page. That's the next one. So we're starting in highest heaven, right at the top there, and we're going to use the very highest run of letters, and you read them in two directions. So if you read them from right to left, they say shining one. If you read them from left to right, they say clothed in scarlet. So we know who we're dealing with. And then from the center of this upper heaven, you have a triangle that comes down into the Holy of Holies, and it's formed with those two letters where I've got the black dots in the Holy of Holies. And if you read them from left to right, got a sheen and a dalet for those of you who read Hebrew, that's the name of Shaddai, that's the name of the great lady. But you join those to the two central letters at the very top, and they look like a Roman letter L, and in fact they are an L in archaic Hebrew. If you take the red line starting at the left-hand side in the Holy of Holies, you follow it across and then go up to heaven, that says the Queen. If you take the blue line and start in the Holy of Holies by the dot, you go up to heaven and you come down again, that same triangle says the one who appears or who flows down into the Holy of Holies. And you notice that in the midst of that triangle, which is the lady, the Queen, in the midst of that triangle, there is the central lamp of the menorah who represents the Lord, and he is coming down, and just underneath the two bottom letters, the geminated sprout from the tree of Jesse. So this is the birth taking place. Now let's look at the next one, next part of the story. Now, if you look at the blue line on the left, you start at the black dot, you follow it down, and then back up again to the name of the lady. That says Holy One. And I put those two grey triangles in to remind you that they said Morning Star and David. And then very faintly, just above, we've got the Queen coming down from heaven. So here, she comes down from heaven, and she produces in the Holy of Holies and coming down onto the earth, a Holy One. If you start with the right-hand line, the red line, he comes down to earth and up to his mother. That again is a son. So this is the lady giving birth to her son who comes down to earth. And in the Holy of Holies, she has all these titles. So let's look at the next one. Then, if you look at these lines in reverse, you have the red one, and you start again by the black dot. You follow it up and down again. Remember, it's the same as the one that said son. This one says Redeemer. And if you take the blue line from the dot and then go up and down again, that says he is the remnant of the divine glory, and the robes of the high priest, the glorious robes of the high priest, was said to be cut from the remnants of the divine glory. So here he is, the Redeemer clothed in glory. Let's look at the next one. Now, when he comes to earth, and we're still using the same letters, on the red, you have got the black dot, and when he comes down to earth, that gives you the word weak. And the blue line, when he comes down to earth, that's the word that means bound with a yoke. He is bound with the yoke of the servant. So you can read a lot of the book of Revelation and Christian theology from those particular sets of letters within the Holy of Holies, and where appropriate, either going up into the highest heaven or down onto earth. And now this is the end of the story. We look at the last, this is the last picture to show you. We put the next one up. This is very complicated, so the end of the story. Here, I've left in faintly all the things we've seen so far. The Queen coming down into the Holy of Holies, giving birth to David, the morning star, who comes to earth as the son and the servant, and he comes with all these things. You remember in the book of Revelation, as the lady gives birth, a red dragon is waiting down beneath her to devour her son, but he escapes and goes up to the throne of God. If you start at the black dot and you follow that triangle up to the right, so up and then down again, that says snake or dragon. If you follow the same from the dot and you go up to the left, down again, that also says snake or dragon. He is the great dragon, the deceiver of the whole world. He's an important figure. He's geminated, and he is already thrown down to earth, and he is waiting to devour the child of the lady. So that is just a little bit of what can be read from the letters of this oracle tablet. I have something like probably 200 pairs of words now from this tablet, which between them describe the messianic theology of the Old Testament, and it's told in terms of a female figure, the mother figure, and her great tree, the menorah in the Holy of Holies. And next time I'm going to tell you something about this great lady of the temple and her menorah, her great tree, and how you can extract from this some of the knowledge that she reveals, the knowledge and the wisdom and the power, all these things which, with your knowledge of Kabbalah, you will recognize straight away. So there we are.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a couple of questions while Bernadette can maybe find some things that might be on chat, if there are any questions. One of the things that intrigues me about this, Margaret, is that it's really a symbolic language, and that symbol really includes maths and geometry in a much easier way than modern understanding of symbolism would naturally do. Can you tell us more about what it's like to enter into symbolic language in this way?
That's actually a very difficult one to answer, because I think you have to be prepared for it before you start on the enterprise. You know, the children's party game, Hunt the Thimble. If you don't know what a thimble looks like, you don't know when you found it. And I think you need to have a good knowledge of temple symbolism and to be at home with it, to be able to recognize a pair of words that actually make sense together. I mean, I began with, the Lord is my shepherd, because everyone will recognize that. But perhaps fewer people would recognize David as the morning star, for example. That's requires a little bit more specialist knowledge. I assumed you would have that. So working with these symbols is very, very important because it's the way that they thought, and we do we distort any possible process of research if we come to it with our post-Enlightenment ways of thinking. And I mean, even thinking that Hebrew always has to be read in straight lines. I mean, that's quite an interesting one when you discover that Hebrew can be read from right to left, left to right, round the corner, up and down, all sorts of things. When I first began to realize this, that was actually quite difficult. It's extraordinarily difficult when you're used to reading Hebrew from right to left, suddenly having to read it from left to right. So there are all sorts of things like that, but certainly coming to terms with people who thought in this symbolic way, and then you realize that as so many stories and so many, I think there's a lot of Isaiah's oracles in this tablet, but I haven't time to tell you those. You realize that, for example, the snake in the Garden of Eden is the same as the snake in the book of Revelation. And he is also the same snake on whose nest or hole the messianic figure plays. And in Isaiah's oracle and Isaiah chapter 9, a child will play on the hole of the asp and so forth. It's the same snake each time because it's using the same letters, different combinations and all the rest of it, the same patterns on the same little tablet. So it's a very, very interesting experience. And I've got to the stage now, the work I'm doing at the moment, when I'd found one pair of words, and then I found the first of another pair of words. And I thought, come on, come on, come on. The other one has got to be here. And I looked and looked, frustration. And then suddenly I realized that there was an alternative spelling of the word I was looking for and hoping for, which has only survived in Aramaic. And I thought, well, I wonder if in fact that Aramaic spelling was also known in some dialects of Hebrew or whatever. So I put that new word that I found in kind of in pencil, and suddenly a whole lot of other things fell into place. So it did work, but you've got to be prepared to enter into a completely different world.
Do you think that this way of thinking and studying is quite influenced by being very aware of that whole, which is timeless?
Oh, yes. I think that's very, very important. The idea that all of this comes from the timeless state where things exist in outline, to put it crudely, as Clement of Alexandria did. Things exist in outline, they're there, and they still have a certain fluidity which enables unity. Once you have come out into the world, and this is implicit even in the Genesis story, once you come out into the material world, the role of the male figure, actually, the figure translated as God, his role is to divide and to distinguish and to keep things separate. But the role of the female figure, who is also there in Genesis 1, her role is to keep things together. And so between them, they hold the creation in its distinct state and in its state of separation, but also held together. The first footnote in the famous Stuttgart edition of the Hebrew Bible, which is the standard one that most folk use these days, first footnote reminds you that Origen, the great biblical scholar, died in 253, he read the Hebrew of Genesis 1 differently, and he didn't point the letters as we do. And so for him, it wasn't in the beginning God created heaven and earth. He read it with E vowels as Bareshet. By means of the net, God created heaven and earth. And so the lady who is fluttering over the chaos at the beginning, the Spirit of God, she is there with a net that holds all things together. And then the God is there to separate things out. And this is a lovely picture of the complementarity of the two. But we've lost the lady completely.
That's for next week, isn't
That's for next week, yes. Forthcoming attractions, that's right.
One of these striking things that I see on the menorah is that if we're looking at it as an early, a very early depiction of the tree of life,
yeah,
I can see the two pillars of opposites and a central column.
Yes.
And this dynamic of opposites seems to be a very, very important part of the actual layout of the temple, and then also the way the tablets are read. Can you say something about the dynamic of that symmetry? And
that's actually quite difficult. When you've been living in a world, as I have for about 10 years now, it's quite difficult to describe it, because it's just the world I'm living in at the moment. So probably the answer is no, Marie-Elsa. It's like when, the great question that evangelical Christians tend to ask, when did you no, what difference does the Lord make in your life? And the answer is, if you've been brought up as a Christian, you don't know anything else, so you can't describe the difference.
And well, Carl Jung talks about, for instance, beyond the archetype, or in the very center of an archetype.
Yeah.
He talks about the dynamic of these opposites being really imperative, and if you lose the dynamic of opposites and try to make everything just one-sided, then you will have a big repercussion.
Yes.
So there's always this kind of dual thinking, symbolic thinking.
Yes, that certainly is true of these of these tablets, and this in fact is the constraint upon establishing a meaning, because you can find all sorts of words that are just one triangle, or there's not just triangles, some of them are as complicated as, well, there's even some hexagons. The way to show, the way you can know that this is a valid reading, is that there is always an exact and precise mirror image, and that balances and constrains what you can read out of this particular tablet or any of the tablets. You can't just say, oh, look, I found an interesting triangle, and write it down. You say, yes, but where's the other interesting triangle that goes with it? All sorts of interesting words that I have found, but if they don't have a balancing other, then I don't include them. Well, I put them on one side to think, the balancing other might turn up, and in some cases it does. But certainly without the balancing, what I would call the mirror image, without that, then I wouldn't allow it as a valid reading.
Wonderful. And you mentioned it being an oracle, which is, a big part of temple ritual.
Yeah.
So how do you imagine that a high priest would go to a lead book to ask the question, to listen for a revelation?
Well, there is a very curious, it's called a wisdom text amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it invites the young student to gaze on something. And this student has to gaze on something and learn the ways or the paths, but that actual word is missing, it's a broken manuscript of everything that is. And I suspect that the processes of these ancient prophets were a much greater version of what I do, which is just sit and look at the thing and think, what on earth is this about? Because when you look at a set of letters, in Hebrew, as you know, you only write the consonants. You supply the vowels, and as you supply the vowels, you supply the meaning. Now, if you put the Hebrew vowels together in the conventional order and utter them in sequence, they actually say, or they sound like, the divine name. And so when the Lord breathes through, because the vowels are essentially the breathing, when the Lord breathes through these letters, they speak, literally. And on another day, you could come and you can find the same letters, and I've had this experience, and the letters say something else, which is why it's important to record them as they come to you. And I suspect that by gazing and contemplating and praying, whatever they did, inhaling incense, things came to them from looking at these oracle tablets. When they emerged, they could say, "Thus says the Lord." Because who else would have the authority to emerge and say, "I'm speaking words from the Lord"? These are questions that we don't ask, and yet "Thus says the Lord" is all through the prophetic texts.
It's a very profound understanding of word.
Oh yes, but then they did this because they had the same process of emanation for sound as they did for images. So there's the nothingness, and then there's the inchoate, and then finally there's the solid form, the image. You have the sound, which you can't hear, and then that becomes a voice, and then the voice becomes words. And that is linked to the emanation of knowledge, because once you have words, you can begin to attempt to express knowledge. So the whole thing, you see, the people who preserved this tradition called themselves the Silent Ones. And the word for silence in Hebrew is very similar. You can to this word for the image, the demut. And Isaiah was one of the silent ones. You know, the famous call vision, when he is warned that he says, "I'm among a people of unclean lips." He doesn't say, "Woe is me, I was undone." He actually says, "Woe is me, I am a silent one. And despite this, I'm living amongst the people of unclean lips." And so then he goes off with his great tirade against them, basically. So these tablets almost certainly were kept in the Holy of Holies. And when the temple was destroyed, there are some very interesting parts in the book of Jeremiah, for example. Remember Jeremiah's call vision in chapter 1? Jeremiah is called the year after the great purge of the temple. You could do that by just comparing the dates. And the two things that he sees in his call vision, the first is an almond branch in danger. Well, the almond branch, clearly the menorah and the high priest. We know what was going on there. The second thing he sees is usually translated, "I see a cooking pot and it's boiling over," as if this was some kind of rustic scene. But in fact, what he's seeing is a small smelting pot, and somebody is melting down metal as a part of destroying the first temple. Well, we wonder what they were melting down. It was a small pot. Must have been something quite small. And then later on, chapter 6 or so in Jeremiah, he says, they blow the bellows, they melt the lead, something like that, but the evil still remains. Which is interesting. So you can, smelt down things all you like, but the problem is not dealt with. So there are all sorts of places where the English translation doesn't really bring out the significance of what those words actually mean.
Gosh. I'm going to turn to Bernadette, see if there are any questions. I think Michael had.
Hi, yes, we do have a couple of people who are asking questions, and another one. So the first question, which was from Lynn, is how was this visionary material transmitted to Yeshua? Could it have had anything to do with the community and Safed in Upper Galilee?
That's a very interesting one. I suspect that it actually had to do with the community of exiled high priests living east of the River Jordan, some of whose representatives came in Matthew chapter 2, and we know them as Magi. But a community in Galilee is certainly a possibility, because all sorts of things were preserved up there, and a lot of the Enoch traditions associated with Mount Hermon and things like that. So that is a possibility. I have only explored in any detail the communities beyond the Jordan that are hinted at in John's Gospel, and also the fact that these little lead tablets, these particular ones, were found in Jordan in an area that is mentioned frequently in Isaiah's prophecies. I suspect that Isaiah's disciples in exile were the people who kept these things and kept the knowledge of how to read them, because these things are extraordinarily sophisticated. And I bat my head against a brick wall for hours, and if I can find 3 words in a week, I think I've had a good week. So there's a huge amount of work to do. Any volunteers?
Michael Hatwick has asked to tell the story of finding the tablets. How
were they found?
And how, why and when did archaic Hebrew letters become Torah Hebrew letters? 2 good questions.
2 very good questions. The first question is the story of how they were found. It depends who you believe, because Bedouin are not very keen on letting you know where they're finding things, and we have heard various stories associated with various places and various people. So the answer is we may have been told the real story, or we may have been told lots of other stories. So I can't really answer the first one. Second one is that the script used on these books is a version of the archaic Hebrew that is known from First Temple inscriptions and things like that. But some of the letters are different. 7 or 8 of them are different. And it was only by trial and error, lots of trials and lots of errors, that I managed to work out what the other equivalents were. Now, when was the script changed? Well, that was deliberately changed when the exiles returned from Babylon, and they imposed the new script on people. And it was a way of distancing the Second Temple from the First Temple. It was to mark the new beginning, a bit like when they abandoned and imposed the Roman alphabet in Turkey. It was a sign that this was the beginning of a new Turkish republic as opposed to the old monarchy. And this new script was actually sort of introduced by the scribes, the Aramaic script. The old script is usually called Paleo-Hebrew. Very like the script that is still used by the Samaritans, but again, not identical.
Rachel asks, can you say anything about the dating of these tablets?
The answer is no, because lead, I'm told, and here I'm speaking like a parrot, I don't know anything about metallurgy, I'm told that lead is notoriously difficult to date, and we've had various estimates, but nothing that you can build on and say, well, we know how old this is, da, da, da. So I'm doing my work on the basis of the Hebrew vocabulary and also the grammatical forms that you can find, because languages evolve, just like, if you read Chaucer, it doesn't look like Shakespeare, and that doesn't look like Dickens. So the original of the tablets I'm working on looks as though it comes from around about the time of the exile or late First Temple. It could be a very sophisticated forgery, and anyway, it could be a copy of something very much older. So there's so many unknowns, and it's better to be honest about that than say, this is something written by Isaiah. A lot of the vocabulary suggests it does go back to Isaiah's school of disciples, but Again, it could be a very sophisticated forger. I can't think who'd want to forge it. The subject matter is definitely Isaiah.
Going back to what you were saying before about it being the first and the second temple being different, how different was it theologically? I can see that the priesthood represented the mankind as the priesthood of all creation, and that's something that changed in the second temple. I'm just wondering if you could just describe to us.
The difference between them, well, fundamentally, it was developing a form of Judaism that didn't have the Davidic monarchy and therefore did not have someone on earth who was the representative of the Lord, because the Davidic kings, their title was Emmanuel, God with us, and they were believed to be the presence of the Lord. And the Second Temple Manifesto, which you see in Deuteronomy chapter 4, absolutely enforced the rule that there was no image. And the idea that, the Lord was, Isaiah has a vision of the Lord, and it's clear from his language that he sees, a shining human being, Ezekiel, similarly. So that was part of the old thing. And what develops in the Second Temple is an aniconic tradition, because they were against the idea of, for example, a divine Messiah. This is why you get that question so often in the New Testament. Why does David call Solomon Lord? Because he was his son, so why does he call him Lord? And the answer is, once he has been anointed and enthroned, he becomes the Lord. He becomes the presence of the Lord. And for Christians, just the blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God, that would have been completely anathema to Second Temple theology. The vision of God is something that is not possible. Deuteronomy chapter 4, when the commandments were given, you heard the words, but you saw no form. They are absolutely adamant that you cannot conceive of God in human form. And so what the Christians were doing was reviving very much the old idea of the Lord present in human form. This is why St. John emphasizes, we have seen his glory and so forth. And then in John's first letter, we've touched him, we've handled him, we've seen him. And underneath all this is a polemic saying we are going back to the first temple. So there was a huge difference between them. And I think Christian exegesis of the New Testament, any exegesis of the New Testament, has spent a lot of time up cul-de-sacs because it has tried to find a direct link between the Second Temple and Christian origins, whereas in fact we should be looking to the First Temple for the roots of the Christian worldview.
That puts quite a different perspective on the early Christians as being kind of rebels fighting for the First Temple.
Absolutely does. And the First Temple priesthood was characterized by Melchizedek, not Aaron. And the book of Hebrews describes Jesus as a new Melchizedek. And you can't have it plainer than that. And then John chapter 10, when Jesus is talking about the Good Shepherd, that's of course referring to Ezekiel. But he then refers to all the bad shepherds who have been, and the bad shepherds in this other temple tradition were the Second Temple high priests. And so John chapter 10 is not just, a nice homily on how Jesus is a kind shepherd looking after sheep. It's a direct attack on the Second Temple priesthood.
Which puts a different perspective into his attack of the Pharisees and Sadducees as well.
Absolutely,
being a fellow Jew.
Yes. So there's a whole lot of shifting paradigms, which are very exciting.
We're coming to the end of our time, Margaret. There's just so much that's gone into this talk. I think you've laid a really good foundation for the geometry of the temple and how they might think and perceive with the lead books, and what this first temple theology is like compared to the second temple. I know we're going into it more in the next two.
In the next two, yes, we shall indeed, including the heavenly ascent, which I think will be impact more upon what Kabbalists are interested in, what they're doing.
So next week we'll be looking at the Asherah tree and the lady in the temple, which was also taken out in the second temple.
Yes, that's right.
So the divine feminine.
The third one, we're going to look at the mystical ascent. Mystical ascent happens in 7 stages, and if you remember the picture of the lead book, the Holy of Holies has 7 letters up each side. When you join them across, you have an interesting ladder of ascent. Which is what we're going to look at.
Can't wait. Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And if you've got any questions, just email them to us for next week, next month, and look forward to seeing you again then. Thank you.